In 1984, a doctor walked into his lab, picked up a petri dish full of bacteria that everyone said could not survive in the human stomach, and drank it. 5 days later, he started feeling sick, bloating, no appetite. His stomach was inflamed. And that was exactly what he wanted. Because Barry Marshall had just proven, using his own body, that the entire medical establishment was wrong about one of the most common diseases on the planet. A disease that, left untreated, could perforate your stomach, causing internal bleeding, or even turn cancerous. Everyone tells this as a story of one brave doctor. That framing misses what actually happened. Marshall was a young gastroenterologist in Perth, Australia. His colleague, Robin Warren, a pathologist, had been finding spiral-shaped bacteria in stomach biopsies for years, but nobody paid attention. When Marshall joined him, they started connecting those bacteria to ulcers. Marshall had already published papers. He had data. He had evidence showing that a specific bacterium called Helicobacter pylori was present in the stomachs of ulcer patients. He'd demonstrated that association cleanly. The medical establishment looked at this data and shrugged. Interesting, they said, but not decisive. Meanwhile, surgeons kept performing operations. Pharmaceutical companies kept printing money on acid-blocking drugs, and millions of patients kept suffering from a chronic condition that was actually curable. Marshall was fighting an economy. Ulcers were a business model, a career path, and a definition of what good medicine looked like. Being right wasn't going to be enough. So why did Marshall have to poison himself to change anything? Here's what made Marshall's self-experiment different from just publishing another paper. In early July 1984, Marshall underwent a test to confirm he was completely negative for H. pylori. Clean baseline, no existing infection. This matters because it eliminates the easy objections. 3 weeks later, he drank a suspension of the bacteria. The prevailing wisdom said this shouldn't have done anything. The stomach was considered too acidic for bacteria to survive, let alone thrive. Textbooks taught this. Professors believed it. The entire field operated under this assumption. 5 days after the ingestion, follow-up testing confirmed colonization and gastritis, the same type of inflammation believed to drive most peptic ulcers. This means he was, without any possibility to dispute it, totally vindicated. Bacteria did cause ulcers. It had to happen in this bizarre and extreme way because peer-reviewed data fails in a paradigm conflict, even with documentation. Data leaves room for the incubant frame to declare the anomaly irrelevant for whatever reason. Contamination, selection bias, correlation, and not causation. But if a healthy investigator demonstrates baseline negativity, then self-inoculates, then shows colonization and inflammation on follow-up, and does all this while putting his own health on the line to prove it, those easy objections collapse. Marshall's self-experiment was an assault on deniability. He turned himself into a walking exhibit because the system was structured so that ordinary proof could not land. To understand why Marshall's evidence couldn't work through normal channels, you have to understand what ulcers were before H. pylori. Not the disease, the economy. For much of the 20th century, peptic ulcer disease was treated as a chronic acid problem, sometimes a stress problem, often a surgical problem. Vagotomy, cutting the vagus nerve to reduce stomach acid, was a standard procedure. This was serious medicine. Ulcers belonged to the surgical domain. Real doctors did real interventions. Then the drug era arrived, and instead of weakening the acid paradigm, it strengthened it. Cimetidine hit the market in the mid-1970s. It was an acid blocker. It worked. Patients felt better, the mechanism was elegant, and the profits were extraordinary. At its peak, This single drug was a multi-billion-dollar annual business in 1980s money. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about one of the most profitable pharmaceutical products in history. Once a treatment frame has a clean mechanism and a blockbuster drug, it stops feeling like a hypothesis. It just starts feeling like reality itself. This is just how stomachs work. This is just what ulcers are. Against that backdrop, Warren and Marshall's claim that ulcers were tied to a bacterial infection sounded like a category error, like someone saying cars run on sunshine or water instead of gasoline. The stomach was supposed to be too acidic for bacteria. The bacterial model implied that a huge fraction of ulcer care had been organized around the wrong kind of problem entirely. In 1983, Marshall and Warren published findings showing bacteria present in the stomach lining of patients with chronic inflammation. In 1984, they reported these same bacteria in most patients with ulcers and suggested the bacteria was actually causing the disease. Those papers were asking colleagues to reclassify the disease, to admit that the framework they built their careers around might be incomplete, maybe even wrong. A worldview employs people. It funds departments. It creates what counts as a serious specialty. It produces prestige. When ulcers are treated as an acid disorder, a certain kind of competence gets rewarded. A careful doling out of medications, elegant pharmacology, sophisticated surgery for the difficult cases. But when ulcers are treated as an infection, the center of gravity moves. The old work doesn't become worthless, but it becomes less central, less heroic, and in some cases, less necessary. But Marshall wasn't the first doctor to face this problem. There's an earlier case that shows what happens when you can't break through. In the 1840s, at Vienna General Hospital, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered something disturbing. Maternal mortality was far higher in the doctor's clinic than in the midwife's clinic. Women giving birth attended by physicians were dying at much higher rates. He traced the difference to one behavior. Doctors were moving from autopsies to deliveries without washing their hands. They were carrying something from bodies to living mothers. But when Semmelweis instituted mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution, mortality dropped from mid-teens percentages to below 2% within months. And was he celebrated? No. He was categorically rejected and declared to be out of his mind by the local medical community. If you read this story through a modern germ theory lens, the refusal to adopt this method looks insane. The data was right there. The intervention worked. Why wouldn't they just do it? But if you read it through the institutional lens of the time, it looks grim but very coherent. Semmelweis could show an intervention worked. He could not supply a mechanism the establishment recognized as real. Germ theory was not installed yet. Cadaverous particles sounded like mysticism or superstition. More importantly, his conclusion implicated his colleagues directly. The new practice didn't just say, "We can do better." It said, "Your ordinary work has been harming mothers." Semmelweis was asking colleagues to accept that the defining ritual of their profession, the learned physician moving from case to case, was a vector of destruction. That is not a technical correction he's asking for. That's a public demand for self-indictment. The old frame preserved their innocence. The new frame distributed serious guilt. Semmelweis died in an asylum in 1865, still largely rejected by the medical establishment. Semmelweis shows us what Marshall was up against. So why does this pattern keep repeating? Think about what happens to a gastroenterologist in 1985 who spent years becoming an expert in acid management. If the bacterial story wins, his expertise doesn't become worthless, but it does become less central, less heroic. The status he earned under the old rules gets repriced under the new rules. That feels like theft. People don't experience their resistance as I am defending my status. They experience it as this is not how reality works, because their professional self has been built inside that particular description of reality. Here's something that looks paradoxical until you see the structure. Even people who privately suspect you're right may still oppose you publicly. Imagine a senior physician in 1986 who reads Marshall's papers and thinks, this might actually be right. Does he say so at the next conference? If he does, and the bacterial model doesn't take hold, he's the guy who sided with the fringe theory. His judgment becomes suspected. His referrals dry up and his career might stall. Public adoption requires him to defect from the coalition that grants him legitimacy before the new coalition is stable enough to protect him. So he stays quiet. He waits. He lets someone else go first. A paradigm tells people which facts matter, which risks are tolerable, and what counts as a responsible response. Organizations select for plausibility before accuracy because plausibility allows coordinated action without embarrassment. When you threaten the paradigm, you're threatening the coordination mechanism that tells everyone what responsible looks like. So why did Marshall succeed where Semmelweis failed? Marshall did something most people who are right early refuse to do. He paid the cost personally to change the cost structure for everyone else. He didn't just submit more papers. He constructed a demonstration that moved the argument from interpret this data set to watch this happen. That shift matters because it changes what kind of courage is required of the adopter. Marshall's self-experiment gave other doctors something they could use, a pre-assembled sequence they could point to without having to fight the full battle themselves. Baseline negativity, ingestion, symptoms, colonization, and cure. It condensed an abstract causal argument into a narrative that was easy to repeat. Semmelweis couldn't do that. He lived before germ theory existed. He could mandate practice locally, he could even get results, but he couldn't give physicians a framework that let them adopt hand washing without feeling accused or irrational. Marshall gave the field a story, and stories spread when they give people something they can repeat. Proof arrived in 1984. Permission arrived in 1994. Prestige arrived in 2005 when they received the Nobel Prize. That gap is the paradigm defending itself. By February 1994, the NIH Consensus Development Conference recommended antimicrobial therapy to eradicate H. pylori in ulcer patients, a full decade after Marshall's self-experiment. Marshall and Robin Warren received the Nobel Prize in 2005, 21 years after the self-experiment. The establishment's retroactive stamp of approval, filed after the paradigm had already shifted. The Nobel framing treats their work as transforming ulcer disease from chronic reoccurrence to a condition that can be cured. But more than a scientific conclusion, it was a reallocation of what counts as legitimate medicine in that domain. Today, if you go to a doctor with an ulcer, you get a course of antibiotics. 2 weeks later, you're cured. The condition that once meant a lifetime of medication or surgery is now treated like strep throat. Marshall is still alive, still working, still occasionally giving talks about what it took to change medicine. He drank a petri dish of bacteria 40 years ago, and the world eventually caught up. Being right early means you're fighting a disease model and a prestige model at the same time. You're asking for admissions that can feel morally catastrophic. You're threatening how an entire field defines responsible action. Most people assume the obstacle is ignorance or corruption. It's rarely either. Your audience doesn't yet have a script that makes adopting your model feel safe. They can't use your evidence without a framework that lets them speak it. If you're sitting on evidence that the world isn't ready to hear, the question isn't whether you're right. The question is whether you can make your map easier to adopt than their map is to defend. Don't fight for correctness. Fight to make being wrong more expensive than changing their minds. Join my free newsletter, link in the description. I break down how influence, incentives, and power actually work so you can navigate them better. And if you want to go deeper on other people who understood institutional dynamics better than anyone around them, subscribe for future videos. Thanks for watching.